Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro. With me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman. And this is Global Insight. Moscow is seeing its biggest protests in years. Tens of thousands of Russians have been out on the streets. The authorities have responded with mass arrests and a violent police crackdown. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Bruce.
These protests seem to have come out of nowhere. Did they?
No. In fact, just before Putin became president again in 2012, there were much bigger protests, nationwide, not just confined to Moscow. They were protesting widespread electoral fraud. Mr. Putin quickly put those down once he got into power again. And the crucial thing to note is that there's been some level of discontent for about at least the last year. Mr. Putin raised the pension age from 65 to 67. Now, this occurred in a society where there's been economic stagnation, massive corruption, and growing inequality. And I think some of those things are beginning to influence undercurrents of discontent. And the immediate issue that you referred to were the protests in Moscow. There was a gathering on August the 10th, and about 60,000 people attended. This is small for a city of 12 million, but they were largely young people. And the other thing to note is that it wasn't just the fact that the protests were held. The protests were held, by the way, because the authorities have excluded opposition candidates in the Moscow city elections. Now, the irony is that Moscow City Duma doesn't actually have much power. But many of the opposition candidates have been excluded, and there's been a backlash to that. When the latest of the series of protests occurred on Saturday, more than 1,300 people were arrested, but also the police handled them in a very brutal fashion, which was captured by mobile telephones. So discontent about the exclusion of opposition candidates has morphed into discontent about police brutality. And while this was all going on, Mr. Putin was in the Crimea with his levers on with a motorcycle gang and extolling the motorcycle gang as a model for the youth of Russia, which apparently, if you believe the social media, was a laugh. It was just regarded as laughable.
Why do you think the crackdown was so severe?
I think that this is a very insecure regime. I mean, Mr. Putin, you have elections in Russia, but it's not elections as we would understand it in the West. These are simulated elections, really. Opposition candidates are routinely excluded. All the people elected are there with the approval of the regime. So it's a Putin system. And Mr. Putin's shadow is long. And I think, that this is a situation which is potentially explosive. One of the reasons Mr. Putin has been backing extreme right-wing nationalist forces in Europe has been to deflect attention to some of the shortcomings at home in his very authoritarian government. And one of the biggest shortcomings has been the economic failures of Mr. Putin's leadership. After invading and annexing the Crimea and also getting involved in intervention in eastern Ukraine, a conflict that's killed more than 10,000 people, the Russian economy has gone into decline. It was growing very slowly in 2013, but between 2014 and 2016, there was no economic growth at all in Russia. Russia has an economy which is even smaller than Italy's. So, in its own the Russian economy is only a 12th of the size of the American economy. Now, given this economic stagnation, and given the fact that many Russians are seeing those close to Putin living a very prosperous life, this is likely to cause considerable unrest in the long term.
What is it that Putin would be afraid of?
I think he'd be afraid of losing power. He's made a lot of enemies. He's been in power essentially since 2000. There was a brief period between 2008 and 2012 when he became Prime Minister and swapped jobs with Mr. Medvedev, but he was still the power behind the throne, and he returned to power in 2012. He must leave power under the Constitution in 2024. He has, a lot of people have met unfortunate fates who've opposed or been seen to oppose Mr. Putin. And one of the disturbing things about Mr. Putin's rule is that he constantly casts his opponents as traitors and enemies of the people. And once again, those arrested on Saturday, mainly young people, some of whom were too young to vote, have been cast as puppets of foreign interests, particularly Germany and the United States and EU countries. So the protesters now, this is a warning to the protesters, by the way. They're saying the whole state is mobilised, including state-controlled media, that all protesters are essentially they're traitors, puppets or lackeys of the West. So this is a warning to people not to get involved in protests or face the consequences. Some of the brutality, by the way, was really stark. There was a graphic picture of a young woman being punched in the stomach by a Russian policeman, which was captured on video. So I think Mr. Putin is facing real challenges at home. I don't think those challenges are going to dissipate. Many Russians, irrespective of their political views, did not like the fact that Mr. Putin placed under house arrest the leading opponent, Alexei Navalny, so that he couldn't compete in the 2018 presidential election, which of course Mr. Putin, deprived of a credible competitor, duly won. Since then, Mr. Navalny's been on the receiving end of some appalling treatment. There was a bungled attempt to poison him while he's in jail, and he's still under detention as we speak.
Putin appears a very strong figure. Do you think that's what he is like inside of himself? What sort of character is Putin?
I think he's insecure. I don't think he's particularly strong. Anyone who goes around with their shirt off and having pictures taken of themselves are not particularly self-assured. He seems, like all authoritarian leaders, he seems to want to surround himself with people who basically agree with him. And there's no shortage of people who do agree with him in Russia. But the thing is, being an authoritarian leader, you do have to deliver economically. And that's one of the problems he's facing. He's presided over a largely unreformed, energy-dependent economy. And of course, when energy prices fall, the Russian economy also suffers. The other thing is that Russia, since 2014, has faced sanctions from both the United States and the EU. And although his buddy, Mr. Trump, made it to the White House, that in itself has not brought sanctions relief. Mr. Putin sees these sanctions as an affront to his authority, and he sees himself very much as a strong man, inverted commas, but that doesn't mean he's strong or resourceful. And I think he's facing real challenges now. He may be reluctant to leave political power because he may worry. According to the US Treasury, he's involved in widespread corruption. In 2016, January 2016, the US Treasury said that Mr. Putin, since 2007 or perhaps earlier, had accumulated more than $70 billion in his own accounts. So, he may be worried about leaving power because how can he protect himself and those of his inner circle? And certainly his inner circle may not be wanting him to leave power. So he may be looking at, what Xi Jinping did in China, which is to amend the constitution to allow him to stay. I think he's facing a downward trajectory, essentially.
And is what's happening in Russia having any impact in Western countries?
Well, I think what Mr. Putin his foreign policy has been having a big impact on Western countries because he's been trying to break the international rules-based order upon which countries like New Zealand is critically dependent. And that's why he supported the likes of the Brexit leadership. That's why he supported the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, extreme neo-Nazi groups. They are trained in Moscow. They get backing from Russia. What he supports Le Pen in France. It's no coincidence that Mr. Putin is supporting all these nationalist-populist figures in Europe. He is trying to break the EU. And why is he trying to do this? Well, because the model of liberal democracy does appeal to lots of young people. And he knows if he can say to Russian people, look, democracy in the EU and the United States is a mess, it's chaos, doesn't work. That means he's saying to the Russian people, you've got no alternative but to accept my leadership. But it's a high-risk strategy for the reasons we mentioned earlier, because he's got problems at home.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Do svidaniya.